It's lovely to see everyone. So, as I said a few minutes ago, my name is Belle, my pronouns are she and it. I'm a member of the Socialist Workers' Party in the Sheffield branch, and I'm here today to do the In Conversation with the wonderful Rebecca J. Morgan, who is the author of this brilliant book, Deviants and Trailblazers, A History of Trans Activism in Britain, something that I think is very pertinent to this day and age. And I think, building on that, Rebecca, I first want to ask, I suppose why now? What I suppose was the motivation behind writing this book?
Yeah, awesome, thank you. Sorry everyone, I'm a little bit late. I was today twice on the tubes. They're not socialist run tubes, I guess. I think there's like a few different things that made me want to write the book. Like, number one is the state of trans history at the moment. Trans history kind of has it's very polarized in the sense that there's lots of really, really, really small studies, literally like this scene in this city in this date range, and then at the other end of the scale there's like super big, thinking like Kit Hayham's Before We Were Trans, really longue durée history. But I felt that there was like a lack of that happy medium, where it's just like we're paying close attention to what happened, when did it happen, why did it happen, and sort of putting it in context, and giving like a clear account of how we got to where we are today. And also I think that in Britain a lot of our queer and LGBT and trans history tends to be, it almost becomes American history with like a British addendum. It all started at Stonewall, whereas, in my research I found like very few references to Stonewall in Britain until like the 90s. So it just wasn't that important here. I just wanted to write something that could be accessible, that's just like, this is what happened, sort of set out a story, I guess.
Absolutely, brilliant. Obviously we don't want to sort of go line by line through the book, but I think something that appealed to me when I was reading it was that, obviously, like you say, it's very hard to actually find a history of trans activism in Britain, but also I think what really struck me was the Corbett versus Corbett case. I don't know if maybe you could speak more on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, for a lot of British trans history, not so much nowadays, but certainly in the 70s, 80s, 90s, early 2000s, this case, Corbett v. Corbett, which took place, the ruling was issued in 1970. This case was kind of like the founding myth. It was like the legend of how trans activism in Britain got started. Essentially what happened, so there was the son of the second Baron Rowland, so a noble guy, Arthur Corbett. In 1963 he married a trans woman, a socialite and a model, called April Ashley, who became April Corbett, obviously. But the marriage quickly broke down. April's transness was known to Arthur from the beginning. But when the marriage broke down, he didn't want to pay any, he didn't want to go through the settlement process, he didn't want to pay maintenance, anything like that. He just wanted the marriage to be gone. So the argument that he made in the High Court of England and Wales is, well, April Ashley was never a valid wife to begin with because she's legally male. Therefore the marriage should be just annulled. It never existed, almost. And this case, one of the things that Roger Ormerod, the judge in this case, said is that there is, in British law, no such thing as a change of sex, which is categorically wrong. So at least since 1874, when Parliament passed the Births and Deaths Registration Act, from that point onwards, you were able to change your legal sex by sending basically like a doctor's note, like a fit note almost, to the General Register Office in London. And many people, trans and intersex, did this over the years. We don't know exactly how many because very few people actually were public about it. But this was a thing that, almost a century of precedent, that this judge, Roger Ormerod, just brushed aside. And I think this is Corbett v. Corbett. I started writing the book before the horrible 2025 Supreme Court decision, which I'm sure we'll get onto. But there's a sort of symmetry there. In both cases, the judge or the judgment said things that were not just wrong, but like obviously wrong in like really embarrassingly simplistic ways. So yeah, in Corbett v. Corbett, it was like, there is no such thing as a change of sex in English law. Well, then why is there a specific statute that tells you how to change your sex in law? So yeah, that case became really big, and because Ormrod said that there was no such thing as that change of sex, it became much bigger than just a marriage annulment case. It essentially obliterated the ability of most trans people to change their birth certificates, and a lot of other documents. A lot of government departments, like the Department of Health and Social Security, said in the aftermath of like, oh no, we can't let you have a national insurance card in the correct gender. We can't let you pay into a gender pension scheme that accords with your actual like gender identity. So it became like this cataclysm almost, and that's how it became like a founding myth of this is where British trans activism begins, right? They took away our legal rights, and now we have to fight to get them back.
Absolutely, thank you for that explanation. I think it's obviously, as you say, incredibly important in understanding where we are today, really. I think a couple of other things that sort of came up in the book was this sort of thread that you weave through it about recognition, or perhaps misrecognition, which obviously I think as a trans person is obviously very important. Do you think you could speak a bit more on that sort of why that's a focal point for you? And yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a focal point for me in the book because it was such a consistent focal point for almost all of the activists and organizations that I talk about in the book. You know, since the 1970s, like the first trans activist conference in the UK, or like national trans activist conference, was at Leeds in 1974. This was someone was like doing this at the back. Are you from Leeds? Okay, there we go. Went to Leeds. Yeah, it's 1974. This was the first time the phrase trans person or trans people was used in anywhere in the world, as far as we know. But yeah, like right from that conference, it was a lot of emphasis on the birth certificate. And this continued to be the case like through the 70s with the Beaumont Society. This was the first trans communal group founded in 1966. Into the 80s, where you have other organizations popping up like the Self-Help Association for Transsexuals, which amazingly, the abbreviation is SHAFT. Judy Cousins, the founder of the organization, was like, yeah, I know, but I didn't think people would be that dirty. People were, in fact, that dirty. And then through the 90s, when you have this really pivotal campaign called Press for Change, and this was the campaign essentially that got us the Gender Recognition Act in 2004. Which restored to some trans people, trans people who had a diagnosis of gender dysphoria and could fulfill a few other criteria, allowed them to change their gender as the Act puts it, for all legal purposes. Which is another way that the Supreme Court was just like obviously wrong. So yeah, like, and of course after we got the Gender Recognition Act in 2004, one of the big campaigns, sort of the biggest campaign we had recently, was the campaign to reform the Gender Recognition Act so that you no longer had to have like a medical diagnosis or anything like that, to base it on self-definition, self-declaration of your gender identity, like they do in Ireland and a few other countries. So yeah, it's just like throughout the history, recognition is such an important issue, and for large periods of time it was like the issue, like everything hinges on it in their minds. And whilst from a current perspective, and especially from like a socialist perspective, that might seem a bit like bureaucratic, like weirdly sort of, hinging everything on what the state does or doesn't say about you. That might not seem particularly transformational, but I don't think we get anywhere just by, constructing a false history. The fact is that recognition was the issue for most of British trans history for the last 50 years. And yeah, like the book is just trying to like analyze why that is, why it matters, and where that might be going in the future.
Absolutely, thank you. I think obviously you've spoken about, how I suppose trans people were subjected to so much legal work around, and obviously we'll talk a little bit about the Supreme Court ruling and all the stuff in the last couple of years and the HRC guidance. But I suppose like, there's quite a lot of medicalization, especially around the term like transsexual and things like that. I mean, you could be a card-carrying transsexual until like 2013 or something from the NHS. I suppose, like, how does, how in your view does that medicalization kind of impact the trans experience and perhaps barriers that people face, maybe?
Yeah, I mean, perhaps slightly less so today, but still, it's still the case. We'll get onto it, I guess. But for most of the last 50 years, like, medicalization has been one of the most important, if not the most important factor in terms of shaping like how trans people experience life, and also, of course, how we experience transphobia and bigotry. You know, the presumption for a very, very, very long time was that. I want to back up a little bit more, actually. So, in the early 20th century, the primary way in Britain of understanding gender ambiguity, sexual ambiguity, was hermaphroditism, what we now call intersex or differences in sexual development. But one of the most important theories that emerged in the sort of late 1930s, 20th centuries was that you could be a hermaphrodite whilst having a normal body. This is sort of where the you know, female mind or female brain, male brain theory kind of comes into play, right? The idea that you can be a hermaphrodite, meaning that your body is like one way and then your brain is the other way. And this kind of, although the language changed and a lot of the medical standards changed, this essentially just morphed into the predominant understanding of what transsexualism was, right? Is that you're trapped in the wrong body or those kinds of narratives. And that, so yeah, I mean, the only way that you could get medical care for example, like hormone, you know, therapy or surgery, reconstructive surgery, was by playing into that, playing along with that system. And so, yeah, I mean, if you look at a lot of trans, like, periodicals, you know, magazines or books from the 70s and 80s, what you quickly see is, like, yeah, they're really, either they're actively playing into it, or they're kind of unknowingly playing into it, being like, don't worry, we're the acceptable transsexuals because we are medically diagnosed, we are medically supervised, and we have a piece of paper that says we are. So my first diagnosis wasn't gender dysphoria, it was probable transsexualism. I think we're way past probable at this point. Yeah. But you know, that's still the case today. I mean, like I said, the Gender Recognition Act still requires today, if you want to change your legal sex through the Gender Recognition Act, you have to have a diagnosis of gender dysphoria. And this means all the cards are not only in the hands of doctors and medical institutions, ultimately it's in the hands of the people who control those institutions, politicians, you know, the sort of billionaire class. If, for example, if there was an act of parliament, or even just a new regulatory set for the NHS to say, no, you can't provide this kind of care. If you can't get a diagnosis of gender dysphoria, the Gender Recognition Act is obliterated. Just, it doesn't work anymore. And that was, of course, one of the core things in the campaign to reform the Gender Recognition Act, is like remove the medicalization. Remove this idea that the only people who can ever tell you who you are is like a doctor you see for a few hours every month or something. Yeah, medicalization is it's still with us to an extent. Obviously nowadays we have more of a communal infrastructure around demedicalization, and this, you know, you can find many trans spaces where medicalization isn't going to be like predominant. So in that sense it's reduced, but it's still very much with us. Like it's very important.
Absolutely. Let's talk about the Supreme Court ruling.
Woo!
Yeah! Everyone's favorite thing. You know, obviously, I think, you know, such a traumatic time for many people. In, you know, last year, I believe was it late April, around that kind of time. You know, we've sort of all had our hearts in our mouths, just waiting to see what was happening. I think what was your immediate reaction, and yeah, what was your immediate reaction, I suppose?
I think my immediate reaction was probably a lot like most other trans people, just like stunned, paralyzed, kind of. I didn't know what to. I didn't expect it. I expected it to be bad. I didn't expect it to be as bad as it was. So just to kind of explain, so for anyone who's not, like, you know, up to date on this, it just helps to get us all on the same page, I guess. So effectively what it comes from is in 2018 the Scottish Parliament passed an act to ensure gender equality, equality of representation on public boards. So it's quite a small, localized, specific kind of measure. But what their original plan was to include trans women within that definition. There was then a long series of court challenges, which I won't get into. There's lots of ins and outs there. But eventually, this case ended up in the Supreme Court of the United Kingdom, which was created in 2000. I think it opened in 2009, if I remember. And the Supreme Court heard this case. The plaintiff, the group that brought it was the anti-trans group For Women Scotland. The case was called For Women Scotland versus the Scottish Ministers. And what the Supreme Court decided, is that within the Equality Act 2010, which is a UK-wide legislation, the word sex, which is a protected characteristic, one of the 9 protected characteristics, only means biological sex. And so the ruling, if you read the ruling, it repeatedly refers to what it calls the foundational meaning of sex, biological sex. But the irony is, nowhere in the entire ruling does it actually try to define what that means.
Yes.
What are we talking about? Chromosomes, gonads, genitals, hormones, psychology? What are we talking about? In Corbett v. Corbett, actually, those 5 things, when the judge actually did try to define what sex actually was, he listed those 5 things: chromosomes, gonads, genitals, psychology, hormones. So, and I think this is part of the reason why the Supreme Court didn't try to define it, because they know that if you try to define it, just immediately you can find exceptions and loopholes, and you can actually challenge it. So I guess the strategy is just don't offer a target to hit at, and then that's kind of so yeah. The Supreme Court ruled that sex can only mean biological sex for the purposes of the Equality Act 2010. This was then reported in the media falsely as Supreme Court defines sex or settles the meaning of sex in British law. It doesn't. There still is no singular meaning of sex in British law, and there never has been and there never will be, because it's unworkable. But yeah, so and of course, after the ruling, a lot of us are okay, what does this mean? So obviously it's bad, but what does it actually mean? And part of the answer, I guess, has been provided by this draft guidance from the Equality and Human Rights Commission. This is a statutory body, so it's an arm's length kind of quango body, created by the 2006 Equality Act. For most of their history, they were actually relatively friendly to trans people, but particularly from sort of 2020-ish onwards, they've been incredibly hostile to trans people. And they issued this guidance to service providers to say, you need to provide single-sex spaces, things like bathrooms and washrooms, and these need to be for biological men and women. But yeah, even now, it's still not clear what this actually means. There's no policing mechanism. You're not breaking the law if you're a trans person and you go into, whatever bathroom you feel most comfortable with. You might be challenged, but you're not breaking the law. There's no mechanism to try you for anything. So we're still in this really weird median space where we know that it's really bad, but we don't know exactly what it means. But sort of tying this again back to Corbett v. Corbett, I think more important than the actual sort of practical implementation of this ruling, the much more important thing is the symbolic aspect, right? It's the entire media reported this as Supreme Court settles the definition of sex as biological sex, which they didn't. They can't. They don't have it's not their role to do that. But the symbolism is that we are now on the back foot. Trans people are feeling like we're on the back foot. We're feeling like we're going backwards. We don't know when things are going to turn again. But everyone pray. Yeah, we don't know when the tide is going to turn, and that's unfortunately, having sort of done this history, I think it's going to be a 3-decade thing, at least. because the way these things usually work is politicians won't actually get on your side until they think it's okay, it's like a 70-30 issue, like same-sex marriage. You know, they won't do it until they feel like the momentum is just so great that we can't resist it anymore. And I can't see that on the horizon. So, yeah, I guess the long and short of it is nobody really knows what this means.
Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose like in that way it's a very worrying time to be a trans person, or you know, people that are families or supportive of trans people. I suppose like one of the things you spoke about in the book, which I think is actually very important when we're coming up against the hardness of transphobia, is actually to delineate or kind of be specific about what form of transphobia is being leveled against you. Because I think, you know, the word TERF is bandied around a lot, and I think you go into this in the book about why the importance of the distinction. Would you like to talk more on that, do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. So 3 years ago, I published a book called Gender Heretics, Evangelicals, Feminists in the Alliance Against Trans Liberation, which is more of like a popular history than this one, but just trying to, you know, delve into the sort of anti-trans movement in the UK, trying to figure out the ideology of it and also the theology of it, because that's a very important aspect. Yeah, so for the past probably 15 years at least, when we talk about transphobia in the UK, we primarily talk about this group that's often referred to as trans-exclusionary radical feminists, or TERFs. These days they call themselves gender critical. You know, that's euphemism is alive and well, I guess. But this sort of what I sort of argued in the book, in this book, is like that those phrases, gender critical and TERF, they're like covering over quite a lot of different phenomena. I mean, for starters, like most people we describe as TERFs aren't even radical feminists.
No.
Like they've never described themselves that way, and even if they do, like really, come on.
They don't really do anything feminist otherwise.
They don't really. Well, okay. So, what was the name of Helen Joyce? Was Helen Joyce? Yeah, Helen Joyce, who wrote that book Trans: When Ideology Meets Reality. There's this passage in that book. I think it's on page 2. Like it's very early, where she says, she tells this historical narrative or pseudo-historical narrative, and what she says is like in the 70s and then like the mid-20th century, when trans people were like, you know, they were kind of within medical paradigms. They weren't really asking for much. There weren't that many of them. Everything was okay back then. But now, they want too much. And the phrase she uses, which is so telling, is they want, and this is the exact words, they want a total rewriting of societal rules. Is that, yeah.
What do feminists want?
What do feminists want? What was radical feminism all about? Why does it exist? Yeah, don't threaten me with a good time. But that's like a very important point actually, because like yeah, in the 70s, anti-trans feminism was like a really specific thing. It was mostly contained within circles that would very explicitly call themselves radical feminists, like Germaine Greer here in the UK, or Janice Raymond in the US. And they were like strident. They were really, really aggressive with their language. Like Janice Raymond said that trans lesbian feminists commit total rape of real women. And she said that the only correct response is to morally mandate it out of existence. Just like gloves off, exterminationist, no problem. But then they went through this phase in the 2000s and 2010s particularly, when they tried, and Helen Joyce was part of this wave, when they tried to soften it, when they tried to be like, no, we love trans people, we love trans people. We just hate trans activists. Or we don't like, we love trans people, but we don't want self-definition in law because, I don't know, like, stuff might happen, like essentially just implying that we're rapists without saying that we're rapists. But they went through this long period of like the language was softer, and J.K. Rowling also emerged from that. Like if you read her original, I think it was 2020 when she published that blog post, the way that she originally expressed her anti-trans ideology was like, very soft. Sorry. Very soft, very like, oh yeah, we love trans people, we know that they suffer from bigotry and horrific like discrimination. We just don't want self-definition. And then from 2020 to today, we've seen this process unfold of like, they realize they don't need the mask anymore. There's just no point. Like you go to a mainstream politician and say, yeah, we just want to like murder trans people, and the politician's like, cool. There's just no need for it anymore. And it's hard to kind of explain what's happened. Because a lot of the politicians who are now like fully, buying into anti-trans narratives used to be fairly sympathetic. Like some of them voted for the Gender Recognition Act. Some of them voted for the Equality Act 2010, which was, sold as being trans inclusive. So, yeah, it's tough to know. And then, of course, I'll just very quickly like wrap up the answer. So the other side of this, and the side that doesn't get enough attention, is the kind of theological side. The Christian right movement. A lot is made of this. So I think we need to like be very careful about how we talk about this. Sometimes, and particularly in Britain, when we talk about the influence of the American far right, the American like Christian right, the Heritage Foundation and these kinds of organizations, we tend to spin this narrative of like, oh, it's dark money that's behind this, and like the so-called radical feminist anti-trans people are like useful idiots, or they're just like puppets. And a lot of hay is made of the fact that, according to various estimates, no one's ever come to like a complete agreement, but according to various estimates, somewhere between $50 and $100 million has come from America for anti-trans campaigns here. But the thing is, like, J.K. Rowling can fund whatever she wants for as long as she wants. That transfer of money is important. I'm not saying we need to ignore it. It's just like, if that money wasn't there, the anti-trans movement would still very much be here. It's not a case of like these so-called feminists are like misled, or they're being like pulled along the wrong path by conservative evangelicalism. They're just genuinely that bad. They are genuinely that hateful, that committed to the cause of being anti-trans. So yeah, even if you got rid of the Christian element from the equation, there would still be a massive problem, which I think is important to recognize. It's just, sometimes we overestimate the significance of that element in this.
Absolutely. But I mean, also like, you look at people in the UK, especially like Farage and Reform, and you do see those echoes of the transphobia that is kind of, especially Nick Tinconi with the, he plays the religious aspect as well, obviously, I suppose, like, do you think you could explain perhaps why you think there's this marriage between, it's almost like a marriage of convenience between people who, have are very vocal on anti-immigration and all the rest of it, they're very racist, and how do you think that aligns with the transphobia that we're seeing perpetuated by those people?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this again is a very important sort of aspect of all of this. So I want to particularly zero in on this Eurosceptic element. So I don't know, many of you might have seen this. It did the round on social media a month ago, maybe 2 months ago. But there's this European LGBT charity called ILGA Europe, ILGA Europe. It's a pan-European LGBT rights organization. And every year they do this thing where they publish this thing called the Rainbow Map. And so it's like a heat map. So the countries that have good LGBT rights by their investigations are green. The countries that have poor records are red. Yellow is sort of in the middle. Throughout the 2010s, the UK was either at the top, like number one, or very close to the top. This year we fell to, 22nd, with a 44% rating. We are now yellow going into red. And I think this plays really well among probably people like us, right? People who believe in equality and sort of universal human dignity. But the aspect of this that often gets overlooked is that we need to be careful about that, because for Nigel Farage and like the Eurosceptic movement, saying Britain is out of step with Europe is a good thing.
Yeah.
You know, it's part of their vice signalling sort of mechanism of how they do this populist campaigning. It's like, oh, Europe is doing one thing, we're doing another thing. Good. You know, that's part of our national sovereignty. It's a sign that whatever Brexit is working, or you know, whatever they want to say. And of course, after this Supreme Court ruling in 2025, where did trans people's minds go immediately? It was the European Court of Human Rights, right? That's the court that in 2002 did two rulings, Goodwin v United Kingdom and I v United Kingdom, two rulings that said that the UK was in violation of trans people's human rights, and the government had to rectify it. That's what gave the initial, like the immediate spark for the Gender Recognition Act. So that's where we went last time, to sort of go above or around the phobic UK state. And that's where people's minds are going now. And I'm not saying we shouldn't do that, but like we have to be very aware that if the European Court of Human Rights rules in favour of trans people against the UK state, that's it. We are out of the European Convention on Human Rights. I think the likelihood is that that would give the spark for a renewed Eurosceptic campaign to say, finish the job, get out of the Council of Europe, get out of the European Convention on Human Rights, get out of everything. It's hard to know what to do. I mean, you can't just not do anything, right? But we have to be aware that, you know, if we are successful down that road, there's probably some pretty awful externalities. None of our options are good right now, I guess, is the message.
Absolutely. I suppose just to finish on this, if that's all right, obviously you've said just now and earlier that you know, where these legal institutions have helped us as trans people quite a lot, they seem to be quite silent right now, and obviously there's that, like you say, is that danger of actually removing ourselves from those things. I suppose, you know, we're at Marxism Festival. You know, everyone here I would like to think is at least a socialist. I suppose what I want to end on is, what would be your message here for people, for trans people, for people who want to fight against transphobia? What should we be going back and doing after this weekend? How do we, as a collective, find the way to move, to resist effectively and move past this horrible period of transphobia? What do you think about that?
Yeah. I kind of want to read the final paragraph or two paragraphs in the book. I kind of talk about this, and you know, it's a difficult topic. So I kind of want to just go back to what I wrote. So yeah, what I wrote is this. I would like to be able to close on some cozy platitude like, we'll make it through this. But the insufferable truth is that not everyone will make it. Some already haven't. What I can say is that this isn't our first rodeo. Because of the legacy left by activists of decades past, we have many critical resources that they lacked, including a matured advocacy infrastructure, a long list of relatively prominent allies in frontline politics, a comparatively robust suite of legal protections, close relationships with other activist movements internationally, and a far larger community of out and proud trans people. All of which means that, unlike those who came before, we don't have to start from zero. That, at least, is a blessing. And that, you know, yeah. I think part of how we get through the next few years is recognizing that this is going to be, let's not sugarcoat it, this is going to be really, really difficult. People that we know might not make it, you know, that obviously we do everything we can to make sure that they do, but we can't ignore that. Yeah, so with regards to like, I suppose I'll finish on this. So within Marxist sort of political theory, and particularly within the trans-Marxist political theory, there's a major suspicion about legalistic campaigning, like campaigns that rely on legislation, regulation, what the state says about you, things like recognition, like official recognition. You know, there's a natural suspicion towards the idea that just changing whether your birth certificate says M or F actually changes anything. Like, is that actually transformational? And I think what I want to emphasize is, so that there was this New York trans-Marxist theorist called Leslie Feinberg. Many of you probably will have heard of her, or them, or her. I mean, Leslie used like, Leslie's entire bio would have been pronouns. Yeah. But what Feinberg pointed out is like, okay, yes, true. In the purity of theory, these things shouldn't matter all that much. But the thing is, we have to be aware that we live in the present. We are denizens of the here and now. And as long as we are here and now, we have a moral responsibility to do what we can to make now as survivable as possible. Right? There's no point thinking about a utopian future if lots of people are not even there to see it, you know, if we let them down on the journey. So yeah, I completely agree. Like, you know, ultimately, what's the most important things? Like, it's the material realities. It's the fact. It's you know, abolishing the housing system that we currently have. Like, landlords should be no more. It's things like a complete cultural and legal reframing of sex work, or just removing it from, you know, legal sort of paradigms altogether. And it's, you know, ensuring that people have water, food, things like, you know, what we often call the essentials. But what I also like to point out is that we can't just think about the essentials as things that literally keep you alive. You know, we talk endlessly, not maybe so much in Marxist, you know, circles, but like just in politics and in culture generally, we talk endlessly about healthy living. We don't seem to talk that much about making sure people have the will to live. And, you know, again, I don't want to be too dramatic, but, you know, I mean, I'm sure this resonates with a lot of trans people here, that, you know, the feeling I have in my trans communities up in Nottingham is like, so many people don't have the will to live right now. They're feeling that like the entire world, the entire country is against them, that things are only going to get worse and worse and worse and worse and worse. So, yeah, I just want to like highlight that, what Leslie Feinberg pointed out. Yes, we have to work towards a revolutionary future, but we've got to make sure that we get as many people as possible through the here and now. And so that does mean engaging with things that maybe we don't have a particularly high regard for, like writing to your MP about this EDM that's in Parliament right now. You know, this EDM to encourage the government to reject the EHRC's draft guidance for service providers. You know, trying to push businesses and charities and others, like organizations that have a public face, trying to push them to be as trans-friendly as possible. Like, I know these things kind of suck, but I think right now we have a moral responsibility to try to do those things. So that's what I'd encourage. Like, think of the practicalities, do what you can, write to your MP, sounding like a right liberal here, and then finally, like, any trans people in your life, like, seriously, don't be weird about it, but like, check in. I mean it. Yeah, I'll end on that.